I've made it. I only need one good afternoon these days, and that's looking good. Somebody asked me to remind you to close your cell phones. So you can do that. And welcome all. As we approach the end of the spring semester, I observe that we have on several occasions delved into history, perhaps to help us understand our confusing and unnerving present. Joseph Losey went back to the days of our founding fathers for examples of what might have been considered employee ownership in the shipping industry at the time. David Myers, my son, and Hussein Ibish gave us a glimpse from the late 19th century of the origins of the discord between Israel and Palestine. Fred Logevall took us back to presidential decision-making on the subject of war 50-some years ago and how it might inform the present and future. Today we come to perhaps the oldest and some would say most unlikely example of what we have learned from that rogue, that foxy Florentine, Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli and the adjective Machiavellian have been historically associated with cunning, but not necessarily cunning connected to ethical behavior. What could be better than discovering that Machiavelli's irony was meant to help people understand when they were being duped? Dr. Brenner, educated at Tulane, at Oxford, and has taught at Oxford and at the London School of Economics. She's a fellow of political philosophy and teaching at Yale, and visiting professor at the Central European University in Budapest. She has argued that Machiavelli spent his life trying to warn people to be vigilant about threats to their political freedoms. And so at a moment in our history when the press is being denigrated every day, when factual reporting is considered fake news, we have every reason to welcome Erika Brenner to the Schemmel Forum. Please come.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you everybody for coming. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Tell me if you can't. And I have to say, thank you. I want to thank Sandra especially for allowing me this opportunity to speak at the Schemmel Forum, which sounds like an amazing program. And I've been saying to her and to my friend Michael Friedman, who also helped me to come here, in the very short time I've been here, I arrived late yesterday afternoon and already met a lot of the faculty and had a wonderful discussion about Machiavelli over dinner. I have been so impressed by the level of civic engagement you have in this university and obviously in this city. I don't think I've encountered anything like it with faculty. I have so many faculty members who are obviously very concerned about civic education, but not just in a sort of talking down way, but trying to learn from the people they're talking to as well. This is something I've not encountered in this level of intensity, so this is a real joy to be here. Just to kind of get the sense of what you already know about Machiavelli, show of hands, how many people have read some Machiavelli? Almost everybody. Okay, almost everybody. Has anyone read him pretty recently in the last year or so? Okay. Anyone have a strongly favorable view of Machiavelli? Maybe the people I met last night might have changed. Okay, but a couple of people do. Anyone have a strongly unfavorable? And that's the last of my questions. Okay, most people are open-minded. Sandra's given us a short taste of my take on Machiavelli, that he's not as bad as most people think. Nonetheless, I mean, when people find out that I work on Machiavelli and have done for about 12 years, the usual reaction is, oh, you must be so depressed, isn't that kind of depressing? And why are you so cheerful, Machiavelli was a terrible man. That was one of my best friends. She just said, oh, Machiavelli was terrible. Don't want to know more. Or I get a more sophisticated kind of response from people who do think that they've read a lot of Machiavelli and know something, and they think, oh, maybe you're kind of a very cunning operator yourself, and that's why you're attracted to him. You're kind of must be, I look so nice and transparent, but maybe you're not really. So I hope I'll make it clear today why Machiavelli isn't depressing at all. In fact, to me, he's been a source of very surprising kind of enthusiasm and inspiration for thinking about political issues today, and made me feel hopeful that there's something people can do about politics when it all seems to be going bad. I mean, I think, 500 years after he lived, he was born in 1469, and he wrote basically 500 years ago. I don't think there's any author who's a better guide to questions that are looming very large today about what to do when democracies seem to be flailing, splitting, not working very well, because these were the questions that he was centrally concerned with, not only questions about good rule, whether princes should rule or some other kind of government. Now, first I'll just say a bit about Machiavelli, who he was, and let's see if I can get the thing right. How he's been reimagined over the centuries. I'll just start off a little bit about Machiavelli before I get to some of his lessons for citizens. He was born in 1469, as I said, died in 1527. He was a civil servant and diplomat in the city of Florence in Italy, where he was born. And late in life, he described himself as a historian, comic writer, and tragic writer. That's a signature to a letter to a really good friend, which tells you that although he had a political career, about which more in a minute, he came to see himself also, if not primarily, as a literary man. He was a deeply literary person who wrote a wide range of things, not just political writings. We tend to associate him with politics and the prince, but he also is very interested in all kinds of different literary genres, which explains a lot of my argument. He was from what we'd call today a middle-class family, probably. He wasn't an aristocrat. He wasn't wealthy at all. He married a woman called Marietta when he was 31 or 2, and they had about 5 or 7 children. We're not exactly sure, but he was a family man. He had a lot of family responsibilities, which doesn't fit with, our usual image of this sour kind of man going out and doing politics. He can be warm and fuzzy, and we actually have some wonderful correspondence between him and one of his sons, and a letter from his wife, which shows a lot of love and affection for him. In his late 20s to his early 40s, he was a sort of low-level diplomat in Florence. He wasn't patrician enough to become a high ambassador or a high political figure. But he did travel throughout Italy, France, and Germany, meeting with lots of kings and popes as part of his political duties. Here are a couple of his writings. You can see a bit of his handwritings. As I say, he's best known now for his political and historical writings, and he had a special interest in warfare. One of his big projects in life was to try to make his city of Florence adopt a citizen army instead of the mercenary armies that most Italian cities had relied on for a century or so. He wanted to turn get something like what we've got today, where you can conscript ordinary citizens and train them to be patriotic defenders of the fatherland. This was a daring and very controversial thing to do at a time when aristocrats in Florence didn't trust the ordinary people. They weren't sure that giving them arms was a good idea because they might turn against them at some point, which tells you that Florence, although at the time Machiavelli was working for them, it was a republic. It was not so different from our democracies today in many respects. Even so, there were elites that were very mistrustful of the ordinary citizens. And of course, his most famous book, The Prince, is widely read today. Why is Machiavelli such a famous name, and what's the reason for his great appeal? Well, just to go from the most superficial or simple reasons why I think he's so popular, his language is so wonderfully down to earth. I mean, he wrote plays. This is a sampling of some of his non-political works, or not obviously, because I think everything Machiavelli wrote has a political and often satirical subtext. The thing he was most famous for in his own lifetime was a play called The Mandragola, The Mandrake, which is a blistering satire of social manners, but also of politics. And he wrote other kind of comic works in his own time. And his language in all these works, as well as in The Prince and other political books, is so engaging. It looks so accessible when you read it. It has no scholastic jargon, and it's written in the Italian vernacular, not in Latin, which was remarkable for his time. He was one of the first people to really write everything he wrote, more or less, in Italian. And he was a man of the people, writing for the people. That's how he presented himself, and that's how he was taken. And I think that still resonates with us today. Unlike a lot of people at the time, he's not part of a school. He was a maverick, and I think that's a second reason for his continuing appeal. You read him, you sense, whether you feel like you understand what he's on about or not, you sense this is an original, a guy who is thinking for himself, taking his own positions, not depending on some school. And that's appealing to modern readers today. We want to think for ourselves, and it's easier, more accessible for us to read someone from 500 years ago if we feel like he's just thinking and not thinking through some tradition. He's also known, of course, for passages like this, which you've no doubt heard or seen many, many times. This coolly audacious voice saying things like, "It's better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. The end justifies the means." By the way, he didn't actually say the end justifies the means, but he does say a lot of things that go in that direction. So it's not wrong. Fortune is like a woman. Fortune is a woman, and if you want to control her, you have to beat her over the head. That's favorite Machiavelli quotes. No philosopher is more quotable than Machiavelli. He worries us, he disturbs us. We're not always happy with the sound of what he says, but it's intriguing. Why does somebody think it's okay to say that kind of thing? And in our own times, of course, Machiavelli has got a very high profile in popular culture, and games, all sorts of video games based on Machiavelli. The word Machiavellian, of course, has come to mean sort of cunning. I think this is an Oxford English Dictionary definition: cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous, especially in politics. Not a lot of that going on around. Television is awash with Machiavellian characters like Tony Soprano, Claire Underwood, and I think I made this slide before Kevin Spacey's unfortunate fall. The great can fall, but anyway. And various combatants in the Game of Thrones, which I haven't seen much of, I confess. And here's another Machiavelli industry that a lot of people may have encountered: the leadership manuals. Machiavelli, there are loads of people out there writing Machiavelli for leaders. And there are new ones almost every year. And they sell like hotcakes. I wish I had the business acumen to write one of that sort. I would make a lot more money than I do from my books I do write. Has anyone read one, by the way? A Machiavelli for Leaders kind of book? Okay, no, I haven't, I have to confess. But I gather that they do not tend to teach Steve Bannon tactics. They're sort of rather nice Machiavelli manuals. They take some of the cynical-sounding maxims that I've just pointed out, but then show why it's not really that cynical. Being a Machiavellian leader is being a thoughtful pragmatist, learning how to manage troops rather than learning how to deceive. Now, so far what I'm saying is showing you that there are lots of different Machiavellis, and that is the fundamental fact. I wish I could come here and say, this is Machiavelli, this is what he says about democracy and what we can do. Unfortunately, it's not so simple, and there's so many preconceptions and different views that people have about Machiavelli that you sort of have to acknowledge them in order to move on to the substance of what he says. So that's what I'm doing. This is maybe the dominant image of Machiavelli we have today, the Machiavellian realist. The story is Machiavelli was the first person in the history of political thought to really say honestly what human beings are like, instead of idealizing them and recommending that we should all try to be a little more like angels or the classical models of virtue. He recognizes that men are ungrateful, fickle, pretenders and dissemblers, evaders of danger, seekers of gain. This is from The Prince. Hence it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to survive, to learn to be able to be not good. For leaders, above all, the view is, and this is the classic reading today of Machiavelli, it's the job of leaders to manage big groups of people and steer them towards common goals. But because most people are not trustworthy, human psychology does not make it easy to steer you, leaders have to be ready to play rough. You have to be ready to sometimes bend the rules, compromise moral principles. Sometimes you might even have to lie, break oaths, attack opponents in kind of unscrupulous ways that laymen might find shocking if you want to stay on top and get the job done. And that's the usual view, but here we get to my view. I mean, after years of studying Machiavelli from different angles, I've come to doubt that this is his real message, though he does sometimes write these things. I've been on an almost 15-year search for Machiavelli, for what I believe to be the real Machiavelli, if there is one. And I'll start now from my latest hunting ground. My first books on Machiavelli were very scholarly kind of analyses of his text, but more recently I've become interested in his biography and trying to understand how his life and the life in his own times might have influenced him and led him to write in the way that he did and what he did. So this is Florence, a lovely old picture of Machiavelli's hometown. When he was born in Florence, interesting situation. Florence was a republican name, in name, but not in fact. It still professed to be a free system of government where a large number of male citizens had the franchise and could participate in government. There were no princes. The name of prince was anathema in Florence. It was not, anyone, no matter how powerful, if you called them a prince, that was almost taboo because they didn't want to admit that anyone was the leader, in fact, a sort of inherited leader. But in fact, for 60 years when Machiavelli was born, Florence was dominated by one family, the Medici. Has anyone been to Florence? Probably quite a few. And you've probably seen the Medici. The Medici are the great cultural family in Florence. They're the people who had massive money. They were very rich bankers and merchants who brought lots of fantastic Roman culture from ancient Rome and ancient Greece into Florence and paid for lots of the most beautiful artwork that you see there now. But this isn't the whole story. They got to the top rank of Florentine society and became de facto, though not de jure, princes by not very nice means. They exploited Florence's deep social divisions that I've mentioned already and exploited the political rivalries and partisanship in the city in order to kind of say that we're standing above it, we can help to arbitrate this. You can trust us not to take sides and to help save your city from its terrible divisions. And they mostly used nonviolent methods. They didn't go around assassinating people, but they were very good at using their money, and they were massively wealthy, to sort of buy other people in councils to support laws that would increase their power and to undermine their rivals. So it was kind of the use of money that allowed them to gradually corrupt Florentine society. Have we heard of this anywhere else? It's a pretty classic thing, it happens everywhere, it happened everywhere. But the Medici, for all their wonderful things they've done in cultural terms, they were the classic operators in this respect. And Machiavelli wrote about some of these operations in a very subtle way in his Florentine histories. He wrote a history of Florence where he basically treats them in this light without being too obvious about it, because you couldn't be too obvious. Now today, we're always hearing that the Renaissance in Italy was a really violent time, that there were all sorts of assassinations of popes and poisonings and blood going on. It was so different from our own societies where bad things happen in politics, but usually in a more tame sort of way. So you might ask, wasn't the Medici's brand of manipulative, cunning politics pretty tame compared to what was normal for that era? Well, that's not how Florentines saw it. And if you start reading Machiavelli and other Florentines, you realize they were actually passionately attached to their republican form of government. They were very conscious of what was going on. And Florence was in fact a legally very, a city that was very proud of its own political institutions, and the rule of law was sacred in Florence. That was the Florentine ideology. We are not a kingdom, we are not a principality. We are based on the rule of law where citizens have equality. And this is very clear. So even though there wasn't a lot of assassinating going on in the political struggles, even so, this kind of manipulation that the Medici were doing was not on. And Florentines watched what was happening with great despair, and a lot of them fought hard to resist the Medici's different sort of movements, though they saw that it was very hard to resist, just as people around the world today are trying to resist attacks by governments on courts or the media. Similar things were happening in Florence. And in fact, one of the families that most notably did try to resist in the early days of the Medici's coming to power was Machiavelli's. He had two cousins, his father had two cousins who were very prominent lawyers who tried to resist and ended up being in prison, and one of them dying because of their activities and trying to restore the rule of law. And Machiavelli's own father was a lawyer too. We don't know much about him, but we can gather that he was a quiet resistor. And in my book, I talk about him. I think he was a very important figure for Machiavelli, a quiet and subtle resistor who couldn't in those times openly complain about the government, but in his quiet ways tried to. Now, when Machiavelli was in his 20s, a big thing happens. The Medici were forced out of Florence. And this led to the creation of a new popular government. As I said, there already was officially a popular government, but now, again, the Medici were declared outlaws and sent off to Rome or wherever. They weren't killed. That's not how they operated. But sent off, and a new, much more popular government was created in Florence with a very wide franchise, bigger than before. And in fact, this was the government, I think this is probably the most democratic government that had been seen since ancient Rome in Florence. There were not many republics in Italy. Most cities in Italy were monarchies of some sort or aristocracies. But the government was always unstable. So sad story, they finally get a republic, but it's constantly fraught with partisan divisions and political factions and threats from outside. The Medici kept trying to come back in, and they kept getting foreign powers to try to help them come back in. So this republic wasn't a happy creature. And Machiavelli soon becomes you might wonder what that quote is about, but Machiavelli became one of the civil servants in this republic, and nobody fought harder than him to try to preserve its freedoms and keep the Medici out. This is a biographical fact. I think it's very important to recall when we come to his political writings. He was also a hilariously funny man. Another fact it's very important to know about Machiavelli is that almost everything he wrote was very cheeky, very audacious. Even when he's got a very serious message, and there often is that too, he's also funny. And political satire is part of his life from an early age. This is from a letter he wrote during the period of the Republican government in Florence, when he was writing about it. The Medici are trying so hard to get back into the city. They got all the support from popes in Rome. They want to become princes again. And Machiavelli is writing about this to a friend who knows about this in Rome and saying, these Medici. And here what it is a kind of allegory. He writes a story about a prostitute that he supposedly visited. We don't believe it's that he really did visit the prostitute, but it's a very funny story where he kind of makes fun of the Medici through by putting himself in a position of meeting somebody who resembled the Medici leader, Lorenzo de' Medici, and but hang on, I'm just. Yes. Oh, well, that republic lasted 18 years, and then Machiavelli, the Medici swept back into power, supported. So we had 18 years of a republic. It didn't work. It crumbled, and the Medici come back into power. And Machiavelli was one of the first people who was singled out. In fact, he was the only person who was singled out as not only untrustworthy, but who also had to lose his job. He'd been in these government posts for quite a while, and the Medici, one of their first acts was to come in and dissolve his citizen militia that he'd helped to create, and soon after that to tell Machiavelli that he had no place in government. A few months after that, he was suspected of being in a conspiracy to hurt the Medici, to kill one of their prominent members, arrested, thrown into prison, and tortured. Now, this is what Machiavelli does when he's in prison, sitting in prison, not knowing if he will be released, with his shoulders aching from his torture machine. He writes a poem to a prominent member of the Medici family, who must have been somebody who he knew had a sense of humor, saying, I have a Giuliano on my legs a set of fetters, my shoulders are aching, look at how they treat poets, I'm innocent. And the whole poem is pleading his innocence, but in a very funny, self-mocking way, which is, this is Machiavelli. Self-mockery is part of his life, but also a kind of medicine for him. When he was suffering most, he makes fun of himself, and he doesn't stop talking to the people who've been who are criticizing him, who are trying to get him out of the political scene. Then he's released in a general amnesty. And 10 months later, after a period of depression and unemployment, he announces in a letter that he's written a little work on principalities that he's thinking of presenting to the Medici. Now, this little work on principalities we've come to know, of course, as The Prince. And the big puzzle about The Prince, we don't know very much about why he wrote it, so there's a lot of speculation and guesswork. But the usual story is that it was a kind of desperate job application to get back in with this incoming Medici family so that he could be back in politics. He didn't like being out of politics. He's at home with his wife and kids, and he doesn't know how to support them. So he thinks he writes a book about how princes can succeed, and sends it to the Medici, who don't really know much about government because they've been out for 18 years, and offers them the gift of his wisdom. That's why he wants to send it to the Medici. Now, he also seems to be praising princely government, and he also seems to be ready to tell princes that anything you want, your heart's desire, I will help you get, even if it's not a very decent desire. For example, he says in the early chapters of The Prince, the aim of princes is to get bigger and bigger empire. You want to be great, you want to be huge, right? I will tell you how you can be huge. And he uses words like huge, grandissimo. You want to be grandezza. That's the proper aim of princes. I'll show you how to be huger and huger on the world stage by taking other people's land through cunning. And here's how they did it in Rome. Uses the Roman Empire that did exactly that. Here's how it is. So you read that and you think, okay, this is kind of, he might have been a Republican before, but this is a little bit cynical. So surely he really has got something more opportunistic going here. Maybe he really is just trying to get a job so desperately that he's changing his old moral colors and becoming a teacher of amorality, if not immorality. But this teacher of tyrants account, which is the most popular one today, it never asks a simple question that came naturally to Machiavelli's earliest readers. Now, the question is this author seriously recommending these kind of shockingly amoral policies to princes? I mean, after all, the head of the Medici family at this point was Giovanni de' Medici, who was Pope Leo X. He had just been elected Pope Leo X, in the first Florentine Pope ever, at the time when Machiavelli was released from prison 10 months earlier. Now, did Machiavelli seriously mean to send this book to the leaders of Christendom and their family? I mean, what did he think he would make the Pope and his family would make of the suggestion that you should lie, cheat, swindle, and assassinate your way into power? And holding up all these examples, not only of Roman emperors who did this, but also of popes. In that context, it would have been very, very audacious to do that and very risky. So in fact, considering that, in the 19th century, before the 19th century, Many of the most intelligent readers of The Prince thought Machiavelli was being ironic. They thought he wrote his Prince to expose the corrupt reptilian methods that a lot of princes were using, rather than to recommend them. And to help citizens see their way, see through the sort of fox-like tricks that princes were using in their own time. The title of the book that I've most recently written is Be Like the Fox. Machiavelli says in The Prince, one must be like a fox. And we tend to think, he means rulers have to be cunning, know how to manipulate people and be shrewd. But what he actually says is one must be a fox to recognize traps. And the reading I offer, and so do many other early readers, is that Machiavelli's main point is to teach citizens how to see through traps that leaders try to set through them, see through manipulations, in order to resist threats to free government. Now, how does Machiavelli do this then? This is first of all, just to say that Machiavelli writes in letters himself things like this. He wrote this to a close friend. For a long time I have not said what I believed, nor do I ever believe what I say. And if sometimes I do happen to tell the truth, I hide it among so many lies that it is hard to find. So there are a lot of things like this that he writes to friends, bearing in mind that letters were often intercepted and read by political authorities. So they often wrote in code, or they wrote indirectly, not saying really frankly what they thought. Now, remember I said that part of Machiavelli's appeal is his sort of lovely, accessible, jargon-free writing. Yes, but that doesn't mean what people often think, that it's straightforward. His writing is not straightforward. The one word I think describes Machiavelli's writing is ambiguous. And if anyone tells you, or you read a book by someone who says, Machiavelli's so wonderfully simple and clear, yes and no, because the message is often very hard to get. His books on politics in particular are full of just ambiguities, teasing, wicked wordplay, words that seem to praise but subtly criticize. I said he tells you to be huge. Princes want to be huge. Princes want to be great. Grande, grandezza. My suspicion, and I've written about this in various books, strong, and I think it's that there are a lot of words like this. Whenever Machiavelli goes on and on about somebody being great, that's warning. That should send off warning signals. It doesn't mean, that's his guy. That's the guy he's recommending to us. Too much greatness, too much extraordinary is hyperbole, that Machiavelli's suspicious of this character. There's a lot of double talk in his supposed advice that sounds sincere, but on closer scrutiny really makes you wonder. So let me give you an example, because all that sounds very nice in the abstract, but here's an example. Recognize this face, Cesare Borgia. Has anyone seen the Borgia series? I've seen the European one more than the American one, but they're both very interesting. This is, Cesare Borgia, the infamously violent son of Pope Alexander VI, who Machiavelli met and knew well from his own days as a diplomat. He had to stop this Cesare from invading Florence, and he did a pretty good job of it, as far as we know. In The Prince, Machiavelli seems to praise him more effusively than anyone else. He says, I do not how to reproach him. I hold him up as a model for anyone who wants to reach power through relying on fortune. So people think, well, okay, this is his guy. He has only nice things to say about him. But if you really read The Prince carefully, just before he tells us about Cesare and all these great things, he gives us a general statement about why some kinds of leaders are better than others. And he gives us his two options. To be a prince of fortune is one thing, but the best way to become a prince and to keep power and be successful over time is to practice what he calls virtù. Not the same as moral virtue that we think of today, so just put that to the side and think about what Machiavelli says about princely virtue, the virtue of a good leader. And this is one of his main lessons for citizens. Virtuous leaders, he says, are self-reliant, patient, they're prudent. One of their main characteristics is they don't just think about what can we gain in the short term. They look to the distant future. They have experience enough and patience enough to think about distant consequences of present actions. They know their own limits. They don't think they can just try to become huger and huger. It comes through in The Prince the more you read. And they respect other people because they realize that if you don't respect other people, they will realize it and they will start hating you. And there's nothing worse for a prince than to be hated. It might be okay to be feared, but you don't want to be hated, because if you're hated, you'll lose support, people will turn against you. That is pretty much one of the bottom lines of Machiavelli's Prince. He does say, however, that leaders who come to power through these methods have to work long and hard. It's not easy. If you want to become huge quickly and easily, without too much effort, you don't want to rely on virtue, because you're going to have to go through transparent processes. You're going to have to prove your merit to the people who are going to back you at any level. And this takes time and it takes experience. But once you get in place through these methods, you have fewer difficulties than the other model of prince. The other way to become powerful, this is a theme running all through The Prince, is to rely on fortune. And he says, if you rely on fortune, you can fly to power really quickly. Fly. He always uses this imagery of big eagles flying high and impressing everybody. And what he means by fortune is mysterious to some people, but he actually spells out in concrete terms. Machiavelli's a pretty concrete guy when it comes down to it. He's philosophical, but he's got a sense of the concrete methods people use in politics, and he wants to tell you. What he means by relying on fortune in The Prince is people rely on inherited money. They use money, they rely on alms, other people's alms, not their own skills and abilities, bribes and favors, and they exploit other people's weaknesses. By using these methods, you can become powerful quickly, but it becomes difficult. You won't be able to maintain it. He says all the difficulties arise for princes like this when they're in place, because this isn't a stable basis for holding power. So princes of fortune have these characteristics. They take shortcuts to power. They're impatient, impetuous, and moody. They're changeable in their policies and their words. They prefer to go it alone. They prefer to have total control. Cesare Borgia is his model of a prince in these respects, and he describes how he did that. They're bad at keeping allies. They're bad at taking advice. They always blame others. They're never wrong. They blame others when things go wrong. And at the end of his chapter of Cesare Borgia in The Prince, he mocks this tendency. He says, Cesare ended up it's not his fault that he lost power, because, his father, the Pope, died. So how was he, it was bad luck that his father, the Pope, died, and the next popes didn't want to support him. But this is a classic example of someone relying on others and not on his own merit and virtue to maintain power. And they have a poor sense of limits. Like I've said before, doesn't sound like anyone we know today. No, this is all just Renaissance stuff. But I mean, what I think is this gives you kind of the basis for a sort of good leader test of sorts. If you put his general comments, the ones I just outlined, together with his actual description of Cesare Borgia, he says he depends on family money and connections and foreign armies to get power. He's impatient and all that. He creates scapegoats, and he loses his state after his father, the Pope, dies. So you have to take basically his apparent praise for Cesare on the one hand and weigh it against the very detailed description of what happens. And that gives you, I think, Machiavelli's real view of a character like Cesare and this type of statesman in general. I mean, I use the analogy with Shakespeare, because there's some great Shakespeare scholars in the room, and you all no doubt know the Julius Caesar thing. Mark Antony, of course, gives this, comes in after his friend Caesar has been killed, and says, I'm not going to criticize Antony, I'm not going to praise Caesar, but, Brutus has spoken before him, and Brutus is an honorable man. he killed his best friend, all Rome is in upheaval, but Brutus is an honorable man. And then he goes on, and the more, at first the plebs who he's addressing think, okay, I guess so, and by the end the plebs are like rabid, wanting to go and kind of tear apart all these conspirators who've killed Caesar, and they realize that Antony does not mean that Brutus is an honorable man, but he's not said a word of actual reproach against Brutus. I think it's this kind of thing that Machiavelli is doing in The Prince. Basically, this is connected to the question of how citizens can become better defenders in democracies, because Machiavelli's kind of deceptively straightforward writing mimics the misleading rhetoric of real-life political leaders. He makes clever-sounding excuses for self-serving behavior and short-sighted policies. And by writing this way, Machiavelli challenges readers to sort of spot what's wrong with the picture. He's sort of giving you, kind of a television image of this is how politicians act. But and I'm not going to tell you it's right or wrong. I'm not going to stand up on a podium and preach to you. You spot for yourself what's wrong with this picture. Just to say also, in Machiavelli's own time, we have these contradictory readings of Machiavelli, and I think this ambiguity explains why you get some people who think Machiavelli was the devil's spawn. Cardinal Reginald Pole, writing I think 9 years after Machiavelli's death, read The Prince and wrote that I had scarcely begun to read the book when I recognized the finger of Satan, which continues to be a very strong view of Machiavelli in the Catholic community. I think even today, I've had some reviews of my books from Catholic newspapers, and I know that this is a Catholic university, but there were many who are resisting it because I think it's a very strong image of Machiavelli, that he is so unchristian, and the finger of Satan is involved in his works. But at his own times, or just thereabouts, a couple of 100 years later, and at the time, we had people who said Machiavelli was a defender of the rule of laws, not of men, and The Prince is the book of republicans. So there were people who also recognized this other sort of reading. And here's another early Machiavelli reader, just to give you a taste. He thought The Prince was Alberico Gentili was an Italian Protestant exile from Italy, writing about 50 or 60 years after Machiavelli's death. And he thought The Prince was a self-defense manual for citizens, but cunningly disguised as a manual for princes. He says Machiavelli was a strong supporter and enthusiast for democracy who was extremely hostile to tyranny. While appearing to instruct the prince, he was actually educating the people. And you might wonder, why do this? Why did Machiavelli, if it's right that Machiavelli was being ironic, why would he do that? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. Partly, obviously, self-defense. It wasn't safe to be so critical of the princes that he had in mind at the time. But I think he also had a positive, constructive aim, which was to test and train citizens, to help citizens kind of reflect on the uses and abuses of political power, and to recognize more readily the kinds of proto-tyrannical behavior that a lot of leaders were engaging in before it was too late, before things really went wrong. And these are some of my favorite kind of lines from Machiavelli that express this view. Take nothing on authority. This is a theme that he repeats in many of his works. Don't let me lecture to you. You're reading my books, but my aim isn't to tell you this is what you should believe. My aim is to get you to think. And by writing ambiguously, you provoke people to think. Don't judge by appearances. That's another big Machiavellian maxim. Don't judge his own books by first appearances. And another of my favorite quotes, there are three types of brain. The brains that think for themselves are the most excellent. The second are those that are ready to learn from those who are excellent. And the third are useless. Are useless. That goes for politicians, but it also goes for everybody else, readers, ordinary readers. He's trying to get citizens to really think for themselves by avoiding the role of authority, who's going to tell them as a preacher what they should do and not do in politics. Now, this takes me to getting towards the end, because I don't know how much time I've got, but this takes us to the real question of what else can Machiavelli teach us about resisting threats to democracy. I mean, I've just said how he, I think, wanted to teach citizens to recognize kind of problematic forms of leadership and to distinguish better between good and bad leaders, leadership qualities, but also policies in his prints and other writings. But he's got other lessons as well. And I think one of the primary ones is political responsibility. For Machiavelli, it sounds so far like he might be somebody who says you can blame the leaders for what goes wrong in democracies. Nothing could be further from the truth. For Machiavelli, political responsibility for maintaining freedom is always a two-way street. That is, blaming, when princes of fortune blame somebody else for their problems, that's bad. When citizens just blame leaders, that's not very useful either. That's not a helpful way to go. Tyrannies happen when peoples don't play their part in making democratic institutions work for them. The real question about how to save democracies is whether citizens let leaders or ambitious people get away with taking away their freedoms. So people need to build up their faculties of seeing through the snares, being foxes in that way, of manipulative and hypocritical leaders. And it's the job of citizens to monitor them and their policies. But vigilance against leaders isn't enough. In democracies like Florence or like ours, where leaders are changing all the time, problems don't start with leaders, obviously. And Machiavelli is really interested in long-term problems that drive citizens to enslave themselves, putting their democracy's affairs in the hands of men or women who claim to defend popular interests but are more interested in narrower private interests or their own ambitions. And like his favorite ancient writers, Machiavelli is very much influenced by ancient Roman and Greek writers. Machiavelli understands these long-term problems as a process of corruption. He uses the word corruzione. And he looks at corruption both in the political system but also in the wider society. We often think today of corrupt actions as kind of egregious, over-the-top bad things that you can spot, illegal actions, or as crimes committed by people with big money or power. Corporations buy politicians to defend their profits. Politicians trade favors with cronies. But for Machiavelli, corruption doesn't always involve straightforward or egregious violations of laws. He takes a broad view of political corruption, and he discusses two main forms that it can take. The one is just private interests creeping over much into private life. And the other is subtler. It's when standards get lowered. Standards of civility, standards of morality get lowered in the name of the public good. And this is maybe the hardest kind of corruption to spot, because people say, in what we might think of classic Machiavellian terms, well, we're trying to do good, but because there's a threat to the state, because there's a threat to our specific, very special interests, we have to kind of lower our standards and perhaps treat the other side in less just ways than we normally would. And Machiavelli saw how this kind of process of doing this tends to feed into something called, what I would call, insidious normalization. People start making excuses for their party or their team behaving badly, and they think it's all right, and they think it's necessary. And the more they have other people saying, this is what's done, this is what politics is like, that's the only way we can defend ourselves, this gets normalized. One sets up a habit, as Machiavelli says, one sets up a habit of breaking the orders, the good orders, for the sake of the good, and then later, under that coloring, they are broken for ill. This is a kind of something I just came across the other day. Has everyone heard of this boiling frog phenomenon? I guess you have. I only came across it the other day, so I'm sorry about the slightly disgusting picture, but it fits very well what Machiavelli's talking about. The idea being that I think it's not true, there is a fable that frogs, if put into tepid or cold water, and then you set the temperature higher and higher gradually, they don't notice that they're being boiled, and then they die. It's true? Okay, I don't see. I've read different things. I've looked. Is it true scientifically or not? And you get different views. Whether it is or not, there is this interesting fable that's what happens. So people don't realize how bad things are when they're inured to it, when they're used to it, and they make excuses for their own side, and then one day they wake up and corruption has set in so deeply that it's really, really hard to fix, because it's not just anymore your institutions, it's not just your leaders. The whole society, ordinary people, have kind of started to think that this is how it is. And you can see that sometimes moving from one country to another, the different things that citizens tend to take for granted. And there are different versions of it everywhere, but it's pretty much everywhere today. Machiavelli talks about it in terms of disease. He doesn't talk about frogs, but he has very vivid images of corruption as a disease that you just kind of, one of these slow burning fevers, he says, that you don't realize is murderous until it's too late. But what causes corruption? Well, frustrated citizens tend to blame leaders, but Machiavelli says there are three other causes of corruption that go much deeper than leadership. One is partisan extremism. Machiavelli thinks robust disputes are great for democracy. They're great for freedom. It's good to have debates. He's unusual in that respect for his time, and really saying tumults, as he calls them, are good, but discords are not good. When differences become discords, it means they're turning toxic. And this happens when partisans start tolerating or excusing bad behavior from their own team, or when they seek ultimate victory. They don't want to share public space anymore with other people who disagree with them. And when elites and non-elites kind of get into a dynamic of mutual suspicion that becomes poisonous, and politicians who want to advance themselves on the back of this can have something to exploit. And Machiavelli is very interesting on this. He says that every democratic society is divided into a few who want to dominate and the many who just don't want to be dominated. I'm not sure if this fits for today, but it does express a kind of political psychology of democracies that I think it says a lot to us in our own times, that there are always some people who think they know better for some reason or another, and they ought to perhaps be running things. And then lots of other people who might not disagree with them on many matters of substance, but they're afraid of being dominated. And that dynamic can produce clashes of values that arise from trying to defend one's own camp. Social and economic inequalities. You don't think of Machiavelli as an economic thinker, and he's not too much, but he's very concerned that democratic laws and institutions need healthy social and economic soil. And he says that it's best to produce an even equality between citizens' opportunity, wealth, and status. And inequalities, he also notes, enrage people more in democracies because there's a sort of gap between the promise of equality that you give to citizens and the realities that tend to happen when economic inequalities become very vast. And then people lose trust in their institutions, and it all gets bad. But finally, citizen irresponsibility. I mean, the first two points, the partisan extremism and inequality, might make it sound like, well, citizens don't really have much choice, do they? I mean, if you're born into a culture where these things are sort of surrounding you and you feel that you're helpless, then what can an individual do? Machiavelli doesn't buy that. He says you can still treat individual citizens, however much they might have been born in a disadvantaged position, however much they might be brainwashed into partisan thinking, you still have to hold each other responsible. And you have to hold yourself responsible too. He does note that social irresponsibility is fed by societies like his own Florence, or like many of ours today, where manic status-seeking and competition is pervasive. Everyone thinks they've got to better themselves by being super, super good. And this feeds a sort of hyper-individualism that goes against any sense of public responsibility and concern for the general good. And he's very aware that deep-rooted values and practices affect individual sense of power, but we still hold each other responsible. And if you don't, he has this ancient concern that you'll end up with something called tyranny, which means leaders who put themselves above the laws and above norms of civility. He says, tyranny emerges when a people brings itself to make the error of empowering one man. It's not the one man going and grabbing the power. It's the citizens who let him, always. Always, in Machiavelli and in ancient Roman writers too. But he also says that the best tyrants are those who claim to be able to beat down those who the people hold in hatred. So the oldest tactic in the book of people who want to become all-powerful tyrants is to say, I'm going to beat up the people that you don't like. And he gives lots of examples in his writings about that. So bringing it to a close, I mean, Machiavelli, as I says, be like a fox. His teaching is to learn to spot signs of danger before it's too late, and these signs go deep into the culture. One of my other favorite quotes, many times the people desires its own ruin, deceived by a false appearance of good, for great hopes and mighty promises easily move it. Machiavelli says when people are exasperated with present political disorders, they often persuade themselves that a one-man redeemer's bad life, as he says, wicked life, will make freedom emerge. So they freely hand over power to leaders who promise to save them from their own miseries. And this is a quote, I'd like to teach people the way to hell so that they can steer clear of it. That's, again, from a letter Machiavelli wrote to a friend. And I think that actually captures what Machiavelli's all about to me. He wants to teach people the way to hell. And if you just read that, you think, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is so that they can steer clear of it. And he doesn't want to teach people to go to hell. He doesn't want to teach people, to put the way to political ruin. He wants to show them how it happens, read about it, learn about it, so you can avoid it. And I think the main people he has in mind are ordinary citizens in that respect. And that's the last slide that I can't resist putting up this quote, which I think also is so kind of timely today. Machiavelli says he's a rule of law man. I read him very much as someone who sees the laws as the key to safe democracy and keeping democracy strong. He says citizens and leaders have to be shackled by the laws. And he says it's worse to have a prince who's unshackled by the laws. A prince who does whatever he wants, he says, is crazy. Pazzo. But that doesn't mean that people, like a radical democracy that allows the people to just express their will directly without worrying about the constraints of the law, is also problematic for him, because a people that does whatever it wants is unwise. So he's gentler on the people than on leaders, but still says we've got to hold each other responsible. So thank you, that's the end. Did I? I probably went way over, but sorry. Sorry if I went way over. Oh, shall I just call on people? Okay, yeah. No, I didn't know if Alison was going to do that.
Well, I'll ask first of all, I agreed with everything that Machiavelli says.
You're a natural Machiavellian, Sandra.
But I'm fascinated by the fact that Florence in the 15th century was, at least for a time, a very democratic place and really governed by the rule of law. How? Why?
How? Why? Well, why? There was a great Roman tradition, of course. The Roman Republic, before it became the corrupt empire of endless expansion and tyrannical emperors, was the ideal of Florentines. And this idea, of course, was revived during the Renaissance when people rediscovered Tacitus and Livy and Seneca and Cicero and started kind of treating them as their Bibles rather than the actual Bible. And so this ideal actually emerged in Florence before, but Florence actually formed its republic before, without an ideology. It formed as a kind of reaction against aristocrats and tyrants who had been running Florence for a long time. And then people also discovered these old ideas that helped them build up their ideology.
I had this question in mind even before you started talking, but after listening to you, I'm thinking, even though I had a fairly high opinion of Machiavelli, it maybe should have been higher, and maybe I've misunderstood. You said at the beginning that he said some things like the ends justify the means. And if that's the case, it may be that he didn't just have any ends in mind, but the good of society. Like a leader should be able to provide stability, food, defense, and do you think he says anywhere that if a leader acts a little strongly to bring those things about, it's okay or not? I mean, given what you've said.
Yeah, great question. When I say he says those things, like I explained, sometimes he says things, but then he goes on to say other things that undermine the apparent meaning of that statement. He says things like, ends justify the means. He says at one point that when a threat to the survival of the state is at stake, you should throw aside justice and do everything. Actually, he doesn't say you should throw aside justice. He says the leader should put aside justice and all other considerations and do whatever is necessary to save the state. But he doesn't end there. Most people grab onto that and say that's Machiavelli's lesson. What he goes on to say is, this is a saying of many kings and princes today. That's what he says. And then he goes on to without saying this is obviously wrong, because they say it, it's nonsense, he says let's take it seriously for a bit and discuss some examples. And then by weighing these different examples, the reader has to decide, is it prudent to throw aside justice or not? And the main message that Machiavelli comes down on over and over again on the question of necessity and the necessity to sometimes be bad is it actually almost never, if ever, is useful to be really bad. Justice is almost always the way to safety. And he gives an example, particularly several times in the discourses, of an attack on Rome by the Gauls, which was caused by the Romans dismissing some ambassadors unjustly and doing all sorts of things that were against the law of nations, as he calls it. Romans went against the law of nations, and they did this in the middle of a war with Gaul. They were trying to defend themselves. They thought they were doing the right thing. But Machiavelli says what happens? Because they behaved so badly, the Gauls not only continued the war with them, they went raging into Rome and almost destroyed the city. Rome was almost burnt to a crisp, and that would have been the end of that because of this injustice. Injustice is not prudent. In that case, he says it clearly. But it's hard to see because of the way he writes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Machiavelli is reborn and appears on the scene today. What do you think he would say and write?
Are we naming names, or are we in general the world? Well, pretty much what I said. I think he would have said not very new. None of this is new to him except for the means. The means of our social media make it a lot harder to control in some ways, the spread of political manipulation and misleading, and the sense of helplessness of citizens is also increased by the massive bureaucratic nature of our democracies today. I think he would find it, he came from this tiny little city of Florence where it's relatively easy. Everyone knew each other. He could write to the Medici, and now we're in a much harder situation where the ailments of democracy not only take place on a much greater scale, there are also kind of the global aspects to it, to corruption, and there's this deep kind of, the spread and the consolidation of values, social and economic values particularly, that run against this kind of government he supports, are so deep. So he would say, you poor people. He might run a mile. Or he might kind of try to come in and say, I think he was a man who said, keep fighting. What I love about Machiavelli is he is a fighter to the, he fought to the death. And I describe the life in my book, and you'll see it. I mean, I see him as kind of a hero of a tragic hero of democracy, because it didn't work. All his fights in the end didn't help to save Florence or the world from, or the free world as it was, the ideas of freedom from failing. But he really fought, never give up. That's one of the chapters in my book, and he says that very clearly.
I think you just answered my question. So if you've already fallen into the trap, how do you proceed?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can read him in a really depressing light, because he often says once the disease has got that far, you cannot save it. And you have some readers of Machiavelli who say, some scholars today, who say he thought there was a role for one great man to, that if you could find an amazing, exceptional, great leader who could avoid all the usual temptations of power and really just fight to the death for his state, that would be the way to go. I think this is completely at odds with Machiavelli's political psychology or human psychology. He says all of us, however decent we think we are, cannot be trusted to deal with power in such a moderate way. So the only way you're going to get moderation and good sense back into government is to have a kind of collaborative system under the rule of law. But it's very, very hard. Yeah.
Your interpretation of an ironic writer invites us to assess what he's saying at every turn. I'm wondering if Machiavelli is, to what degree is he aware of the Socratic approach? There's a veiled reference in The Prince in chapter 15 about people talking about principalities that have never existed on this earth, and I take that to be a reference maybe to Plato and Plato's treatment of the Republic. But in terms of the ironic way of writing and the ironic way of inviting the reader to engage reality through the ambiguities of the text, is Machiavelli following, or is he aware of, has he been influenced by Plato and Socrates?
He is, of course, very aware of them. We don't know if he could read Greek or not, but Plato was entirely translated by a Florentine into Latin in Machiavelli's lifetime. Marsilio Ficino translated all of Plato, and Machiavelli was very aware of him. I read him very much as a Socratic thinker. I don't think he was necessarily a disciple. I don't think he was a disciple of anyone. So I don't think he saw himself as many other sort of Platonists did, as or Socratic, self-conscious Socratics as disciples of Socrates. But I think he very much liked the style of writing, of not directly giving in what you think, but stimulating other people to think for themselves rather than lecturing people. Yeah.
What could I say? Say, timely would be an understatement, don't you think? We really needed this. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I have to run, but thank you. It was great. Well, it's funny to talk about. I mean, this is exactly the
That's what you did,
connections
yeah.
that I'm